these things together and to come and make time. So thank you. I very much appreciate it. Okay, and if I have a coughing fit in advance, I have tested negative for all things. I just arrived from Doha, where I did work on this anti-discrimination project in the World Cup that we can talk about if you want. And the air quality is one of those perhaps problems, so I apologize in advance if I do get into some coughing fit. All right. Okay. So the title of this talk, right, was like Futebol, identities and gender, kindly provided by Juan Pablo. It's a really broad topic, so I think I'll just try to cover a little of my work on gender and nation in Latin America, then move a little bit to the activism side. You know how I've tried to kind of apply it in the Americas in terms of social change. And if you want to interrupt or ask questions, like we're a small enough group, that would be great. So I think I'll just start moving things over here. This is kind of the classic picture when a lot of people think about the history of Latin America. Football or soccer was invented in Europe and perfected in South America, specifically the River Plate area over 100 years ago, 140 years ago, whatever. You've got here Luis Suarez. Sorry, he's out right now. They shouldn't have played him anyway. He's way too old. I say that as an older person. And Neymar and Messi. So you have here the classic kind of forward style developed in the River Plate a very long time ago of Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina. And this isn't to leave out Colombians and Ecuadorians, we'll get there, but here a little later. And of course, it has to do with British investment and capital and the way in which the 19th century worked when England put more money into Argentina, for example, than they did to India or even formal colonies. And that spread and diffused in all kinds of different ways. And we can talk about, why the origin story gets so caught up in having to be about the English expats in South America, because that lasted a very short amount of time before people that you would identify as Jojo or Mestizo or however you would like to term it, but people born in the Americas quickly adopted it, changed it, and then to the surprise of the Europeans were much better at the sport. So in any case, you have at the end of the 20th century, I think, a moment when South America is democratizing, it's looking for a regional identity, it's looking for a new way forward in terms of 21st century importance and knitting together the region. And football became one of those ways. And it wasn't just for people in clubs or people governing or playing the sport, but it was also for commentators. So we had a series of books that came out, and Juan Pablo already mentioned Eduardo Galeano. And so you have some really famous kind of social observers coming out. Again, it matches the picture I showed you before, right? You've got the Uruguayan, you've got the Brazilian, and you've got the Argentine. And these were very important social thinkers in Latin America at this moment. And they made all kinds of arguments that they saw as being progressive. But in fact, none of these books mention that this new identity would include anyone other than men. And that's not unimportant, right? Like it's really actually very important, because this is the very moment at which women are central to democratization efforts in Latin America. And so at the very moment that Galeano, who considered himself, maybe some of you read like Open the Veins of Latin America and you're like, yeah, that's awesome. And it was great. It was really important for a lot of reasons. But 30 years later, when he was reinventing that idea and rethinking of that idea, even when feminists challenged him within Uruguay, it was just, someone else should work on women. Someone else should include women. They just don't play football. And so it was disappointing for a lot of us that loved that book. It felt like a way in which it underestimated the role of women's activism in that moment. And then you have Futebol, Brazilian way of life. The Brazilian way of life also only men. And of course, we're talking about men as imagined as straight men cis men, and usually white men, though when Velos includes Black men, as he has to, working with Mario Filho and other kinds of Brazilian commentators, he does, to a certain extent, at least diversify racially the landscape. And here you have Arquetti's Masculinidades, again, a very important book talking about competing masculinities, right? And how there's not just one idea of masculinity put forward by football and using gender as a category of analysis. Again, like in the index, none there. And it's not that it's just a project of absence, right? It's kind of the way in which you're reframing and rethinking and using history to legitimize certain social movements in the moment. So at that point, oh, I'm going back and forth. No, it's okay. It keeps me moving, Well, I think. Oh, whoops, whoop. Oh, wow. Okay. So I was interested in what was underneath a lot of the kind of high profile professional images of national identity in Latin America. And I was a Chileanist and was already doing my PhD in Chilean history. And I was interested in the South American tradition of mutually owned clubs, right? So the idea of how was football contributing to a civil society? How do you get to the place where you have the Neymars and the Suarezes and all of that? That doesn't come from nowhere, right? That comes from a dynamic culture that develops over many, many, many years. And I was interested in those amateur clubs in particular, which involved a lot of me taking buses in Santiago and trying to make friends with players that thought I was deluded about a lot of things. So, and still probably do. Probably why I can't get this one translated. So, the other one was easy. So, yeah, so I was interested in a mutually owned club environment, the way in which football was a tool of integration for working class men, but also interested in how those competing ideas of masculinity came to a kind of reconciliation about excluding women. And in what parts did they exclude women, right? So physical education, so looking at all of the ways in which this came to pass. And so I looked at immigrants and how football was a vehicle to establish their kind of respectable and alternative versions of masculinity. In Chile, you have a huge Arab population, so working a lot with like Club Palestino, the Palestinian club in Chile. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Okay, wow, yeah, that's more people that know about the Chilean domestic league than I've been around in a long time. This is amazing. And comparing their integration and the way football could integrate them or not, they end up being really violently excluded compared to the new immigrants from Italy and Spain. So I was looking at kind of those as vehicles, and it wasn't like a zero-sum game, right? So I wasn't conceiving of it as you integrate immigrants and therefore you leave out women, right? I mean it wasn't conceived of as a necessary historical fact, but it is a historical fact, but more so probably because as football achieved that role, right? As like different political figures like Salvador Allende went to local clubs and used them as a place to kind of try to build ties with unions and local communities. In that process, when football started to take on a particular capital, women became more and more and more excluded. So what we found with the next book, and which I wrote with Josh Nadel, who's another historian, was that very early on, women played more and organized more effectively in even the very early 20th century, but that as it became identified football more and more with national identity, the further women were pushed out, and sometimes legally, of course, and I'll go into it in a moment, but the harder they push them out, if that makes sense. And this was at a moment when the working class and the social question, you probably, know a lot about that, right? Labor rights, 1920s, 1930s happening. Working class men were generally seen as degenerate, right? Their own habits had put them in this position. They were physically less capable than their middle class counterparts, even though there's a lot of self-disciplining of middle class men, and we can talk about that. Football, as it becomes this national sport, also becomes very important in union discourse and community discourse around working class rights, because it's kind of an affirmation that the working class actually is creative, healthy, strong, and can, sort of represent the nation. And that working class often as a multiracial concept in the case of Brazil, not in Chile and Argentina and Uruguay in the same way in this period. Okay, so as you know, then probably I was looking around when I wrote this book around with Josh around 2014 World Cup, Women's World Cup, 2015 Canada, looking at my first book and saying gender as a concept is really useful. We've done a lot with it. We figured out how it influenced a lot of political discourse and how that changed over time. But if it is about the relationship between femininity and masculinity, if it is about the relationship between the kind of discursive construction of gender and what actually happens, if that's a thing, you know what I mean, among people, then we don't know anything about women. It's just not that, I just don't know enough. And it was very frustrating to me that even though I included it in my first book, I didn't do as much as I wanted. So then this is my going back in, really, really hard. And it was important because, for me, intellectually, because, for example, you can say football is homophobic throughout the 20th century, right? It's not, that's like the easiest thing to say, that, but it's not homophobic in the same way throughout the 20th century. So for example, in all of the countries that I was talking about before, in the case of Brazil, Argentina, Chile, when you see football begin to embody an ideal of masculinity, in the beginning of the century, women then that played football were seen or were supposed to adopt a polar opposite. A polar, so the idea that the ideal woman and the ideal men were just absolutely kind of like different. I don't know how to say this thing that I'm trying to say, but yeah, diametrically opposed, but almost like, when you look at like a carbon copy of something, and you put it next to each other, like, and so the furthest they were, the more heterosexually acceptable that they were, and that's very like, consecrated through things like government physical education programs and through advertising in the new industry around sports, the sports clothes that get to be sold and things. And there's a lot of resistance to that, even from the beginning. It's not just so easy to say that, yes, that exists, but then you go and you take a look and you say, wow, but then there's all these new fabrics in the 20s and 30s, and women are, embracing them wholesale if they can afford them, of course, and playing tennis and things like that. So it's a moving target all the time. There's not one way in which you can say, the football governing bodies, the government, the corporate kind of interests work together to do this one way in which you can be feminine, and then we'll get rid of homophobia if we change that. Instead, what you see is no matter how those ideas may change so far, homophobic power structures will gather to change with them. So let me just give you an example. Like in the 1920s and 30s, there was a lot of cartoons about the flapper, right? This is whether it's Mexico, this book looks at Mexico and Brazil and things like that. So you would have women fans, and we know they're showing up in mass, and they would have short hair. And as soon as that became sort of celebrated by a few different journalists, cartoons started to circulate where a ball would hit a woman spectator in the face that had short hair and makeup and a kind of A-frame, you know, like a not curvaceous, maybe maternal body. And the joke was that the ball had hit her so hard that it had her makeup on the ball. And that was like the joke, which I don't know if people found funny, but I know that it circulated in hundreds of editions throughout Latin America. So it's instructive to women, if nothing else. So that's what I mean. Like it became fashionable, it became acceptable among elite women to a certain extent, and then you see it shore up in new ways so it's a very it's a very hard sphere to study in some ways, because it is so diffuse and it is moving with the press by the 1920s and 30s. So at the time in 2015, what we found was that a lot of the complaints of women's teams and people who were victims of, you know, misogyny, sexism in football, homophobia, racism, were often denied by using history. Like, you know, you just started playing, so just relax, things will get better. You know, progress is being made. So you women on the Argentine national team that haven't been paid in a few months, just, you know, be patient, be patient, be patient. And so there's this use of history over and over again to deny equal resources, right? This just happened, you have to give us time to adapt. It's an incredible argument when you think about it. I mean, because it's sort of like, do you take a calculator and figure out like how many years is an acceptable amount of time for injustice to occur for it to be okay? Like between 6 and 8? Or do we need to give you 12 years to adapt, or 120, or 6 months? Why is anyone given any time to get used to it? But they are. And so when that happened, we went on this and we found scholars echoing quite the same thing, to be honest, right? This is new. So this, you know, you don't know me that well, but when I get bothered, I spend a lot of time doing weird stuff. And by weird, I mean lots of archival work. And so Josh and I started just going in, and this is older now, I found this a while ago. But we started to find and look for evidence of women playing throughout Latin America. And I know, brace yourself, it wasn't as hard as you'd think. Actually, it's not that hard to find it all. And it doesn't mean it's as easy. I didn't find a ton of memoirs. I didn't have someone's, you know, journey like I do with the men's team, where I can tell you, you know, even, you know, someone that kind of like had a 2-year okay career in an upper division of Brazil. I might find an extensive interview about their journey. So I didn't find things like that, but we did find a lot of different evidence that women had been playing and have been playing in Latin America at least for 120, 30 years. And so the whole idea of an origin story needs to be completely rethought. And so this is from Chile. I've shown this at a lot of places. Hi, Chilenos, if you're there. I see there's some people on the internet. And anyway, you've seen it. And so this one is dated 1900, I think, from typography. This is like 1910, actually. But in any case, you have like women playing. You can see the extent to which it's a very outright, you speak Spanish, yes, or I translate, I don't know. Okay, no, so much. All right, so it's basically saying it never would have occurred to us that there would exist in Chile football club made of you know, young women of the weaker and more beautiful sex. And then it discusses the way in which women are stealing their terrain. And this is really important because you ask yourself, you know, why are they so, like, why, who cares? Like, just let them play, right? And then you realize why, right? Why do they care? It says right here, they're robbing us of our terrain. And that means a lot. It means they're robbing free time. So what kind of resources do you get? You get social capital, you get cultural capital, you have free time. Women weren't supposed to have free time, especially on Sundays, right? To be able to enjoy yourself physically without it having an impact on your children or an impact on your partner or your dad. This was very revolutionary for women to do. And what we found is that it was really women physical education teachers that led the way in the 19-teens and 1920s in forming the first women's clubs throughout. So that was really interesting because one of the things that happens in the mid-20th century, you might know this, is that as teaching becomes more professionalized, more men enter, and then they end up taking over physical education positions, and we see less of that role until recently. And then, you know, so we went from Chile, we went to Argentina. We found organized clubs. You can find earlier ones, but what I like about this photo, excuse me, is that you can see the kind of organizational level and press. This is not the first game that these people have played. This is, you know what I mean? Like, you already have set up teams and uniforms and referees and leaders. This is an organized institution in Buenos Aires. It's not even considered, you know, weird. Like, they're not even saying, oh my gosh, can you believe it? How will we survive with Futebol femenino, right? That's not, it's treated very much as if this is something you would have seen all the time. And again, I just want to remind you, you know, it's important to ask why scholars, and I'm sorry, because I know everyone loves Eduardo Galeano. I know, I'm like, I feel really bad about this, but you should never ever teach that book unless it's fiction. Because this isn't okay, right? That they just decided that. So you have to ask yourself, like, why have these scholars of football gotten away for so long with doing this? This isn't something we let journalists do anymore. Do you know what it's just, so anyway, I'm sorry. I know everyone looks sad when I say that. And I don't have that intention. And we also found that it wasn't just, and this was important for us, it was not just elite women. So looking through things like local history libraries and museums. This is from Coquimbo in Chile, if you've ever been there. It's not an incredibly huge place, but you can take a bus all the way up and go to these local historical societies, and I had a lot of help from them in finding this, so hats off to librarians and archivists, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is a donated photo from a laundromat and a team of women from 1928. It was donated in the 1940s, and in the donation you can see the heavy kind of layer of homophobia right from the beginning, to reassure you that the players today are respectable lives. So just in case you were afraid that these community members had some kind of deviant sexuality or life trajectory, this is to make sure that they clear their name, right? And then it lists the women who had successfully been married. So it's interesting the ways in which, you know, even the donation itself, it's like they recognized this was interesting by the 40s, right? Hey, we had a team in the 1920s of women. But we want to make sure that we shore up their reputation through this kind of labeling. So these were some of the things we were interested in. The book and my research tends to be Brazil and Mexico, like it's sort of divided up into that. In the Brazilian case, there was a wonderful, in the Museo de Futebol in Sao Paulo, there was a wonderful exhibition. So I have to say, like, Ida Bonfim, I doubt she's listening, but if you are, and the entire museo put together a huge exhibition on women's football. And that, my book could not have been done. I mean, I think they're like on page 1. They just had thousands of documents, and I walked in there, you know, hey, and they were like, this exhibition's over, no one wants to do anything with it, do you want this pen drive with 10,000 documents? And I was like, yes. And they continue to develop it, and they continue to do projects. Google picked it up. You know, they've done tons of things. So please do check them out if you're interested at all in women's football. Museo de Futebol, Daniela Alfonsi is also the director of the museum, and they continue to do these like awesome, amazing. They host current women players to come and talk about condition. You know what I mean? Like a real relationship between the history and the social justice projects of today. So in this exhibition, what we found is a lot of circus playing, and we also are unsure about if some are cross-dressing, if there are trans players. We think that the circus provided cover for a lot of different types of identities playing in the 1930s and 40s. And this became really important because as women formed leagues in Brazil, especially in 1938-39, so by 1940, women's teams were inaugurating stadiums, including Estadio Pacaembu in Sao Paulo. I'm looking at you because it's yellow. Women's teams were inaugurating that. And right at that moment, they institute what is the most draconian law against women's football that we know in history. So you might say like the British did that, but the British just did that with regulated. They didn't say you couldn't play in your school. They didn't say you couldn't play in your backyard, right? They just said you couldn't play regulated FA games. That's different. The Brazilian government said women and girls couldn't play anywhere, nowhere. Not your birthday party, not your, you know, whatever, graduation, not a kick around, nothing. And we saw this enforced by different governors in different regions. We also saw it resisted throughout that period. The very last player just retired, who was born during the Prohibition, Formiga. Maybe you know her because she played in all the Olympics so far. No, maybe not. Okay, 8. It's a lot. And so anyway, from 41 to 81, it stays in place. We see it enforced, but we also see, yes, this resistance is from 58. And interestingly, today, when you think about Brazilian women's football, you think about its prominence in certain regions, and we think to a large extent it's because they were able to avoid more repression in regions like Minas Gerais than in Rio or Sao Paulo. So it has this really interesting history. And then what we found was that the role of solidarity, and I'm moving up, I'll end in a second, but was really important. So there are these like booms of women's football, and we don't have an explanation. Sometimes like historians, like we could have left it out of the book and it might have felt tighter than just saying, we don't know, but we're not exactly sure. What we know is that there's a family that really loved women's football in Costa Rica. Like just really, there's a particular family, and they have sisters and they have 2 brothers, and Josh interviewed them and they're here. And they organize a whole tour, de Deportivo Femenino in Costa Rica. And that's like all it takes to spark conversations in Colombia, in Panama, about women's football. They tried to ban it in Panama and in Colombia unsuccessfully in this period before they arrived, but they arrive and they have these, you know, kind of kick around. So the solidarity between Latin American women has really been the difference between it being completely lost as a kind of popular practice and it moving on in the 20th century. And so it's not surprising that when women's football finally becomes regulated or accepted by FIFA, that Latin American women's teams actually do really well despite having 0 resources, never being convoked, and being targeted for all kinds of surveillance. And it's not surprising also that the most successful women's tournament is organized by women outside of FIFA and independently of FIFA. So we can talk about that. It's a debate among feminists. Do you work within the system? Do you work outside of the system? FIFA offers a lot of development money. It's always been very hard for women players, no matter how they feel about it, to say, forget it, let's just go a different route. But before FIFA accepted women's football, which was 1988, so they didn't have any regulated like approval of the game. They did actually organize with Martini Rossi, the booze place in Italy. Is that right? It's a booze. It's they do like vermouth, right? Or something. Martinis is the name, but I don't know if it's a real martini. I'm sorry, I should know this. Anyway, the company sponsors it, and they hold the first tournament in Italy. Mexico goes. Mexico, of course, that year held perhaps the greatest men's World Cup of all time in 1970. And then it seems natural that in 71, they would host the second edition of this Women's Cup, which they do, and they, sorry, sell out Estadio Azteca. Sanborn sells it. It's a very like middle-class family type of tournament, all the tickets. And it is the largest women's event, so far as I know, because then Estadio Azteca had 110,000 people. That's entirely different than FIFA. And it's important to know because the arguments that you have today about sponsorship, about monetizing women's sports, about the way in which it has to look, are all going to rely on kind of a market logic that completely ignores prior history, right? We'll only take it from FIFA forward. Right, you might get some English, some history like, oh, British ladies played it, Dick Curse ladies and stuff, but then it like leaps forward to a neoliberal moment in the 1990s when FIFA says, hey, this might be profitable. I mean, you think? And here they invited all over Brazil. It's still illegal, so they don't come. None of the teams come except Argentina. They're called the Pioneras. They, again, today I want to give them credit, have their own Facebook groups. If you ever want to check out their history, they're their best historians. They arrived to the tournament, but their coach doesn't, and neither do their uniforms. So just a funny history thing. I spent a year trying to parse out who the Mexican players were that were on the pitch that I saw warming up on a particular photo. And it turns out that the Mexicans had just loaned their uniforms to the Argentine women who had no uniforms. Very confusing for me. Took a long time. Really sad. I would like that year back, but so it goes. So this is them. They are the oldest group in the tournament. They raised their own money. They were often mothers, middle-aged, and not middle-aged for players. Like they were like early 30s. But figure the average Mexican woman player at that point was about 17. They fielded the youngest team. So pre-motherhood. That's what's important, right? Is like the Mexican government could support the Mexican team so long as they were young women students. They weren't at risk of not caring for their families or damaging their motherhood at that point. So we can talk more about it because I know we should just get into fun stuff, but just to say, the relationship between feminism and sport has been really fraught in Latin America. It hasn't always been great until I would say the last 7-8 years when Ni Una Menos becomes something bigger. The one exception is probably the Brazilian case when it becomes to get rid of the law becomes a kind of feminist cause on them in that moment. And so you can see, but they still make you like not trade shirts and have different balls and stuff even when it gets legalized. And then this is more recently, it really shifts from trying to protect women from themselves, protect women from football, protect their maternity. And instead, it's just sort of a full out by the 1980s. If you can't market it, you don't need it. And the way that you sell it is heteronormative sex. And that's, the woman who's featured here, actually Sissy, I interviewed her for the book, The Captain of Brazil, said she was so embarrassed of this cover that she's inside, she's not on the cover, that she didn't even ever show it to her mom. So she was in like, the major sports magazine in her country. And she said, I just hid it under my bed. It was just so embarrassing. It's volleyball Spanx, obviously. I mean, I don't know how sporty. I love volleyball, but And then you have all these shows that will focus on the wives and girlfriends. In Argentina, they'll talk a lot more about Antonella Rusquela, Lionel Messi's wife, than they will the reaction of the women's team captain, for example, to the last game. And then just to say things really started to change when we started working on this book, not because of the book, but we do hope the book is useful to the struggles that are ongoing in these places. You saw the strike of the Argentine team in 2017 who had not been paid. They get $8 a day for every time they train. I don't know if you've been to Argentina. Yes, there's a currency difference, but it's not that cheap. That didn't even pay their tolls. And this had coincided with Ni Una Menos, right? And this new kind of maybe broader, maybe for the first time, many of the players I interviewed felt comfortable saying they were feminists and thinking about it. And I also think maybe that feminist movement embraced a kind of working class sensibility and gay rights issues in new ways and racial justice in new ways. You know, it grabbed a lot of young people at the time. And women's football became kind of a more natural ally of the feminist movement and vice versa. So in Argentina, you saw women and feminists like Ni Una Menos cooperatives saying, well, let's go to the stadium, let's go support the women's team, you know, pre-Copa America for the first time, instead of just like, oh, the sport is gross, forget it, it's lost to machismo, who wants it? And in Brazil, the same thing. You saw a lot of retirements, strikes, movements around it. And then at the grassroots level, once again, what's underneath all of this is really what's happening, right? A lot of the time, you have in Uruguay and all these other countries, a lot of these commissions within clubs, Colo Colo in Chile, a lot of these other ones have started. And if you have a mutually owned club where you vote for the president and you vote for the board of directors, you have a lot more possibility. I'm not saying they're not corrupt, right? That Flamengo is not corrupt, that Fluminense is not corrupt, but you have a lot of possibility to exert change in terms of your policies, versus if you have the Glazers in the Premier League. I don't, what team do they own again? I don't follow the Premier League. Yeah, that one. So that leads me to this. Which is then I joined this NGO and started working with FAIR, which started as an NGO. That's me a little bit ago being like, what am I doing here? I'm not sure, but I'm smiling. Yay. I'm in the middle of I don't know what. And so following 2015 and FIFA scandals, there was some room for reform. And so in this NGO, what I've tried to do is work with a team of people to run an observation program. I can't talk like so much about it because they're still there right now and I left. But what we do is throughout the qualifiers and everything, monitor for discriminatory behavior in the stands. And that means the homophobic chant, the P chant, maybe that you heard. Mexican fans participated, and actually a lot of US fans that root for Mexico, so I should say that. Working with and sanctioning these federations for different types of discriminatory behavior. So that's why I was trying to find a way to take historical scholarship and say, okay, like, let's do it then. I believe in collective punishment. We can talk about that. If they're not bad, it's just like these federations have so much. Okay, so but I believe that that's a way to change it. They also have grassroots grants for things like that we support an amazing organization that is in Mexico that has a gay and trans league that does point of service at their games where they give out condoms, where they give HIV tests. A lot of grassroots organizations trying to really affect change, and because people love football, like they love it, they really love it. And I don't know if that's dumb or what, I don't care really, because for me as a social scientist, right, as somebody picking that stuff apart, I just see an opportunity, right, to say, okay, like, do you love that it's homophobic and racist? Or do you still love it if we take that stuff away? And I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that it's the latter. So that's what we've been in. And maybe I should just end there so we can just talk amongst us. So thank you very much. I don't know if I like to.
Thank you so much, Professor Leslie. This is amazing. Your work is really inspiring. We can open it up for Q&A. Are there any questions? I have many, but I don't know if someone wants to start. Edie?
I'm not sure if it's the fully formed question or not, but I'll give it a shot. So, Brenda, you showed, or actually you described in such detail that I feel like I've seen the cartoon with the flapper in the stands getting hit in the face with the soccer ball, and it made me think about the relationship between spectators and players, and I'm wondering for the women playing soccer over time, who was attending their games, who was watching them, and what's how does that change in terms of the kind of gendered relationship to the sport over time? So if women were playing in the early 20th century, you know, is it okay for men to be watching them, right? Like what, their bodies, performing on a field. But then that also takes us to the photo that you showed us, the really awful magazine cover of women in volleyball shorts, right? And it actually made me think of professional volleyball. Once it became marketable, the AVP required that women players wear tiny bikinis, right? Like that was a requirement of participating in the sport. And so now that women's soccer is marketable, is there any kind of similar pressure to explicitly sexualize their bodies to make the sport more marketable? I mean, apart from the magazine cover, it's kind of a big question. I don't know if you want to enter it in a particular way.
Sure. Thanks, Evie. Former volleyball player. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I just didn't want to drone on too long, but that's a really important point that you bring up, and I showed a quick slide about it. So with sponsorship, the idea that they can be sponsored, and this is another issue with NILs too, and thinking even a little more deeply about college athletics in this country, or any kind of athlete coming to a sport that's underfunded, or who may be underfunded themselves or need assistance. There's a pressure to sign these contracts, and then you post a certain number of like training videos of yourself on Instagram. So I interviewed the Argentine players for the Futebol I did on the Guardian for the Copa America of 2018, and in it, the woman, I shouldn't say who she is, but she's openly gay at home, was told by the coach, you're really gonna just reduce your selling power if you come out, and you should really try to post, sexy photos of yourself working out, and you can get, because for every they have an algorithm, and so in their Instagram, however much, I don't know, traffic you get from those posts where you're wearing Nike or something like that, they give you money. It's not like these full-time contracts that Ronaldo has for the rest of his life with Nike, or Kyrie Irving with Adidas, or anything like that. But it's like a post by post, which is encourages it even worse to a certain extent, right? And so there's a ton of pressure. And then there's also just outright terror right now about gender verification testing. So in the African Confederation right now, the captain of Zambia couldn't play because she was found having too much naturally produced testosterone. And so the combination of those two things, right, of the monetary incentive and then the governance issue of I better look feminine, because there's not gender verification testing for everyone. It's not mandated by FIFA. It's not mandated by the Confederation. This was a decision that someone took based upon their perception of her. So I think like those are really like toxic and scary combination right now, like the incentive to do it, and then like what you're putting out, then the governance piece, where someone's like, yeah, and now you have to wear this because we want our sport to grow. And there's a lot within the neo and menos movement and a lot within the feminist movement of Latin America, and Lorena Berdula and other people in Argentina that would say, do you want football femenino or do you want football feminista? And like those might have very different objectives. Is your objective to like copy everything? Because the men have it too. I mean, we can talk about Brazil exports about 800 players a year. They are very young. They exploit them. They send them all over and they get money for transferring them. And those boys have also endured a lot of exploitation and assault in similar ways to girls and women players. And so, I think that's the question, is like, you don't want to replicate what has happened in the men's game per se in South America. But between the governance and the market incentives to do that. And that's why when journalists are just like, oh, well, if it doesn't sell, then so what? And the point is, I guess, and I didn't stress this enough because I talked more about old women stuff, but if I went back and I showed you, Boca Juniors, and I showed you all the famous clubs in South America, they've been bailed out by the government like 1,000,000 times. Okay, like 1,000,000 times. The government pays for policing, security, stadium uptake. You know what I'm saying? Like, these are not unsubsidized places. Look at Buffalo. Look at the state of Buffalo that just gave the Buffalo Bills, I don't know, untold millions of dollars and took it away from the education budget. Men's sports are welfare. They're not neoliberal. I don't know that I disagree, but I'm not even making a position on that. But if you say that, it's hard, that's it. There's just what sells, then it's even perhaps more unfair because men's sports are constantly subsidized.
Thank you.
I don't know, that got away from me. But yes, really objectifying. What do you want?
Oh, how'd you know? Oh, that's, yeah. Sure.
Maybe Joe.
When was the ban in Brazil enacted? 40s.
41.
So it was Vargas.
Yep.
I'm just curious, does it fit into the Estado Novo image or objectives in any way? I'm not sure it does, but
Yeah.
I'm looking. You go, okay.
Well, I think they want me to for the recording. We could just talk, but I think they want me to talk into it. Not they, sorry, not
Yeah,
not
people
them.
on Zoom.
Yeah, it's so we thought that through. So basically it's the reconstituted CND in Brazil, the new sports department. It's the first thing they do in 1941. And now Vargas had just attended the inauguration of Estadio Pacaembu with women's team opening the ceremonies. I don't think, or we've not found any evidence that he cares particularly one way or another, but who he puts in charge of sports are these military men that have to do with like regional secession issues. And then the military men that he's put in charge are kind of like very young military bureaucrats that see this as like promoting a conservative social order that they're very interested in. I don't think that they necessarily have an ideology of Estado Novo yet, like these guys, because sports it's important and it becomes super important. But remember, Brazil hadn't really been like the top talent in the world or anything yet at this point. So it's a lot of people rowing. It's a lot of people. So when the ban comes, it's not just for soccer or football, it's also for wrestling, a host of other things that women don't even play. So it feels like it's an exercise in control, probably. And And I mean, there's some patent sexism to it, but nothing that we linked as like a particular, there's medical community members that defend the decision, but we've never been able to find a doctor who writes the main editorial against women's football in Folio. Like, we've never found him. He signs the thing, something like, Dr. Jose, you know what I mean? And we've never been able, and that's what's so difficult is a lot of these men, I don't even know who he is, are kind of used as a way to shore up these, kind of power relationships that they're frustrated by rather than really represent a medical opinion. And that's one of the things that was really interesting. They just manipulate medical information all the time. They have the information, they have journals. And yet they still say things like women may hemorrhage if they get hit in the stomach with a ball, even though they know that's not true. So the CND in 41 uses this medical guide that we can't find too. But yeah, I don't see it as like an important piece, but
It was contradictions.
yes,
I mean,
yes,
my own connection with Brazilian football 40 plus years ago is that it was being a football player was as much as you loved the team and you loved the team, you didn't see these as being respectable people.
right,
And
Yeah.
when something like a medical, like Socrates comes
Yeah.
along, he's like a big deal,
yes,
educated person.
for
That's not the
sure,
norm.
for sure.
So there's a kind of, so therefore there's, a certain, negative view of the sports world in general.
Yeah, because by the so you have 62, right? And certainly by then, with Garhincha already gone and this kind of or on his way out, there's the idea that now it had been taken over by a multiracial Brazil, by a Black Brazil. And so a lot of times the issue with upper class women who are trying to organize or participate in sport is a racial argument. We don't want you in those spaces, you're unsafe. We're gonna save you from Swamisma. Yeah, it's true. But in the 20s, it was still so when we were talking about like working class masculinity being a part of a respectable identity. In the 1920s, the Brazilian national team is still mostly upper class guys, so none of that changes. All right.
Thank you. I want to ask a question
Mhm.
related to what you were just saying. When you showed us the picture of the resistance during the ban, there was a game
Yeah.
played between Fluminense and another
Yeah,
team I
Aragao.
forgot.
Yeah,
Well, it caught my attention that it was Fluminense because I usually associate Fluminense to a more conservative, upper class fan base. They were like the last club to admit Black players, or that's what
Yeah.
some people say.
Yeah.
And they were like taking part in this like resistance. So it just caught my attention. I don't know if you
so
have any
yeah.
comments.
So they're not really Fluminense.
Oh, okay.
So that picture is from Minas Gerais and is them just taking the name. And we see this all the time. And this is one of those contradictions that's hard to work out. Like Diego Maradona, oh man, I wish this wasn't recording, but go ahead. So he's a very sexist person, right? Like he physically assaulted his partner and that was reported and he did not care. And if you interview a lot of women players, even very feminist women players, they love Maradona, right? So I mean, these contradictions are fascinating and interesting to unpack, but it's also true. So in the case of Fluminense, many players of color and women of color in the 1950s would have known that history, and yet they still love Fluminense. It's just, it's one of those, for me, it's one of the more painful things was interviewing the Argentine players and saying, if you're treated like this, why do you want to do this? Why would you want to do this? And they're like, well, I just love Boca. I just love them. Like I watch them every week and they're just beautiful. And Riquelme is just a beautiful player and he makes me want to get out there and like jump and I feel free and I feel liberated. And that's the thing about football, right? It might be oppressive or sport, sorry. But it feels liberating. Let me go.
You want more water?
Yeah.
A question from Tulia.
Gracias, Juan Pablo. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much, Brenda, for a fascinating talk. And thank you for your work and covering the invisibilized history of women playing soccer in Latin America. I wanted to, ask you if in your book you sort of propose any sort of hypotheses or explanations for when and where you find these photos. Like we had photos, going from probably the 19 teens to the 70s that show women coming out, organizing, playing. In two cases, the laundromat and the Costa Rica, there were two families behind it that apparently were, very generative of the efforts to have these women organized. But do you have any sense of, in the face of adversity, in the first of, social norms that go against it, in the face of even prohibition for Chile, for Brazil, what is that causes these teams to emerge when and where they do? Do you have any sort of, common thread or any even, just ideas?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, what we found is like kind of a multifaceted answer. One definitely has to do with the entrance of women into labor unions. And that happens, and that's actually how I got involved with FAIR, was working to organize the Chilean women into a union. And that movement is going on right now throughout Latin America. It's very difficult because if you don't give women players contracts, then they are not professionals, and then the national labor laws get really tricky, right? If they're amateurs or not. So it's very much a chicken and an egg. Are they really workers if you don't give them contracts, but then they are representing the national team, and so they should correspond to a labor union in the way that the men do. And so labor unions, and especially like Perón's Argentina, for example, the expansion of labor unions in the very late 1940s, early 1950s, the Pan American Games of 1951, then Argentine women are very mobilized around clubs and supported by these networks of labor unions. Also in Chile, that's very true in the 50s and 60s. Sometimes, so it's a multifaceted answer because there's not one, but several kind of sets of conditions in which this might happen. That's one that we found. Another one has to do with, for example, and the Costa Rica I bring up because that's one we don't have an answer. Like sometimes people are just doing cool stuff and they believe in a progressive cause and they don't have a history. We've interviewed them. They don't have like a history of, legions of athletes in their families or legions of feminists. Their sisters wanted to play. They thought that was the right thing to do. And that's historical agency, I guess, not conditions that they made, but conditions they worked within, and that really sparked a lot of solidarity. So the solidarity piece is really key. But then the other one does have to do with club structure and governance. And that makes a huge difference. So like for right now, thinking about club structures, if you think about how the women's league in England has taken off, for example, over the last 5 years, that's just investment from top, right? That's just top down. It doesn't mean that they weren't organized in the clubs. They are, but the only way that broke through to have that had to do with the organization of clubs, and a lot of the clubs had close relationships with the press. So when you say like when we find stuff, of course our suspicion is we're finding things also because like Mario Filho in Brazil was particularly amenable to women's football. You know what I mean? And so he not only did he go out there and cover it, but he also encouraged the growth of women's clubs and women's matches. So it's interesting. Certainly there's like an opportunity that they see for the expansion of readership. But I would say movements for democracy and women's social activism in Brazil had a lot to do with overturning that in the late 1980s as well. So kind of like, you know, a constellation of events that have led to different busts and booms throughout the years. I wouldn't say there's one thing. Right now, the thing linking women together is the struggle for equal pay, professionalization, and to keep the clubs mutually owned and not privatized. And so that there's a lot of activity in like you know, the women of River Plate and the women of Old Boys in Rosario, and them kind of, and not just women, actually I should say like feminists and their allies, right? Because they're gender commissions. So these also have resulted in, for example, the first trans woman, Marta Gomez, playing professionally in Argentina. So it's like a real you know, kind of trench warfare out there right now. You have like, you know, some very wealthy and very typical professional forces at play, and then you have real grassroots kind of activity that has been successful. The fact that there's a trans woman playing professionally right now in Argentina that is registered with the Argentine Association is incredibly important, because it means that it sets a precedent throughout CONMEBOL, right? Like they're all knitted together. So I do think those activist networks are incredibly important when they happen. But it is true that throughout most of the 20th century, feminists didn't have a lot to do with women's football. They weren't really. It's still though, right? I mean, still there's a lot of feminists that are just like, ugh. You know what I mean? I'm so glad you do this, because I would never want to do this. I get that all the time. Like there's so many nice women historians, you know, and feminist historians that are like, oh, better you. Yeah, it's acceptable. And it's like, well, I guess. But there's also a lot of like really hopeful you know, movements there. I don't think football's worse. Let me say, I don't think football's worse in terms of the level of sexual assault and corruption. And I think that in fact, it can show you how important corruption is as a feminist issue. That the lack of accountability is why a lot of what has been allowed to happen has happened. But I think it's just more public in Latin America. I don't think it's worse. I think if we took, you know, you know, Apple or whatever white collar sort of environment you want to think about, or professional environment, I don't think we'd find less harassment, inequality, and assault necessarily. I mean, I don't know if it's an Apple. I don't know. I'm just like pulling from the sky. You know what I mean? But I don't think footballers are more sexist per se. But I think it's more public to us. They're more public.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
So I want to talk a little bit, or ask you a little bit about fans and the role of fans.
Oh yeah, I
Because-
forgot all about that. Sorry, Evie.
But I've seen something interesting happening in Brazil, in different places, where fans, football fans, have organized, and at first they were known by the violence, las bravas, the fights. I mean, that happened in Colombia and Argentina. It was a problem, but now these fans are organizing and helping in different ways. For example, in Colombia, there were a huge part of the protest of 2020, 2021. In Brazil recently, with the victory of Lula, and then the truck drivers blocking the ways, fans were helping to that. And I was wondering, if you have noticed something similar in women's football, because I saw one of the banners in one of the photos, and it was saying no more violence, and I was also thinking about sexist violence in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil. That's a big issue, and I don't know if you know something like women's fans organizing or something.
Yeah,
The women's.
yeah. I mean, so, and this goes to Evie's question too, I'm sorry, because I totally forgot that part of your question. I think that they're the same fans. But I think that they have more allies than ever among a younger generation of men as well, young men in the clubs, that the clubs needed a real jolt in the arm in 2000 teens of new members, like the member-owned clubs, like it was really kind of emaciated. And there's been a lot of education that has gone on with older members and older club members. And I think they have seen finally, many of them, women and feminist allies and LGBTQ communities as yes, needing, and this sounds bad because it's gonna sound like they're dysfunctionalist, but yes, needing protection and changing the stadium to feel comfortable, but also providing a youthful dynamism that those clubs were really lacking. And I think that because I've been there, right? Like they invited me. This is hilarious. So I went to Colo Colo, I wrote this book, and I really criticized, I'm so sorry, Colo Colo people. I criticized the mascot of Colo Colo, which is do you know what I mean? It's an indigenous man, yes, during the colonial period. Okay. And it was all the club members, and it was an older generation. Oh yeah, is he not there? Maybe he'll look it up for me.
Yeah,
it was an older generation of club members who, you know, were going to these social talks and, you know, and supporting the gender commission, and they saw themselves as, you know, either hippies or leftists or unionists during Allende. And, you know, but their football had always been fairly conservative. And I think this generation, like I kind of, I know they're criticized a lot by Gen Z, but I guess I would say like the boomers, right? They wanted to be a progressive force, and they wanted to fight privatization, right? And so they've done a lot of work in having these, and I think the fans, I think that the fans are starting, you are starting to see with more activism, the normalization of those kinds of fans and somewhat safer spaces. Like in Peru, the state, there was a whole stadium movement because a woman was assaulted very close to the national stadium. And there was a lot of activity around, okay, this is a crisis. How are we gonna make this a safe place for women fans to come? That didn't happen in every neighborhood in Peru where women are sexually assaulted every day. Do you know what I mean? Like, so that's great if they can use that, if they can use the stadium as a place to say, let's try to solve this problem that applies to much more than just this place. And they really felt, you know, responsible, I think, to make it a safer place. So there are still barras still in Argentina, you know, a lot of games you go to, you're not going to see any away fans. And so they have taken those measures towards trying to protect them. So it's not that it doesn't exist, and the violence is really important. There's a new book by Diego Morsi, who's an Argentine sociologist who writes on football and violence, and kind of thinking through how the Kirchner period in Argentina, criticized as you might, did actually reduce the type of militarized police activity in the stadiums, which does reduce the violence, right? So we do know from Brazil, the more militarized police you put in a stadium, the more violence you have. That's almost everywhere. And so there have been kind of measures around that as well. And I think that the fans, when you're like, who goes to the women's game? I think it's very intentional, like these club members that are like, we want to support this, we want to see this. This is a good feminist political cause, and football is the same game and fun anyway. You know so let's make it a routine. And many who are disgusted by kind of the corruption in the men's game, I think get excited about the possibilities of women's football. Sometimes it's bad because you hear people say like, oh, look, they don't roll around and flap and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, they definitely do. You know, so like, we don't want to like recreate them as some virtuous, perfect, like they don't have to be some moral compass that the men don't. But I think they did really get behind 2018 and going into 2023, right? So now this is really exciting. In the World Cup, have you seen anything about 2023? No, it should make you really, really mad. The next World Cup is just like 8 months away in Australia and New Zealand. Colombia is going, right? And so we've got Colombia, we've got Argentina, right? Argentina, yes. Argentina, Brazil, Colombia. Yeah, anyway, whatever, it's great. And we see nothing about it at all happening. Yeah, the Women's World Cup in 2023. So that's pretty disturbing to me right now about this. So it's not like the people above have taken note properly of what's going on, and that is a problem. Because then they're going to shift gears in 6 months or 5 months, whenever everybody takes a break and has a terrible hangover from the violent, repressive homophobia that has been allowed to go on in this World Cup is so horrible. And we'll try to like rethink about football, and then they'll be like, hey, wait, we forgot the Women's World Cup's coming up right now. Awesome. FIFA's not bad. Look at us support women players. Look at us support gay players. We're not bad. You know, that was just a blip. So look for the World Cup too to be used to kind of do that work out there. Yeah.
I think we can,
People are hungry. I think people look hungry to me. They look really hungry.
no, and I think everyone has questions, but we can have the questions during lunch. So Brenda, thank you so much for coming.